good evening. I'm not Venerable Katie. She did mention that I would be here tonight, so we'll go ahead and get started. We'll just start with maybe just a 5-minute breathing meditation, just so we can settle the mind and kind of move into a different space, change direction a little bit. So sit comfortably with an upright spine, feet flat on the floor, hands in the lap, right over left with the palms upturned and the thumbs gently touching. Eyes are gently closed or slightly open. Try to maintain an awareness of that upright posture, trying to avoid slouching or leaning. And just generate a sense of pulling back your awareness from the environment and holding it to the body and mind. Letting go too of thoughts of the past and plans for the future. Just concentrating your awareness in the present moment by attending closely to the physical sensation of the air moving into and back out of the tip of the nostrils. Trying to notice quickly when anything other than that one physical sensation arises in the mind, and without judgment or frustration, lifting your attention up from that distraction and placing it gently but firmly again and again on the breath. So try to hold single pointedly to that sensation silently for the next 5 minutes. and then generate a broad altruistic motivation for your time this evening, wanting to find ideas, tools that we can begin to put into practice to reduce our own suffering, to expand our capacity to be of benefit to others. And just on your own, set a positive intention. All right. So I'll start by asking if anyone has any questions from last week that maybe didn't get answered, or something that you thought of during the week that you just had a question about from prior material you wanted to address. Sorry. No. Okay. So we will talk about a couple different things tonight. I know that Venerable Katie mentioned visualization meditation, so we'll definitely address that. But there are a couple different parts to the material for this evening. The first is to talk about what are the parts of a complete session of meditation. And so in the material for this class, they describe 4 parts to the meditation, but if I'm presenting it, maybe it's a little bit more technical than they had anticipated, or maybe a little bit more advanced. I don't know. But I would say, because when we are talking about a session of meditation, one of the parts is to have a place of meditation, to set up. And you may have, Venerable Katie may have discussed that to some degree, like what goes on an altar, and that I'm not sure. But to have a localized place, generally in one's home, where one goes to engage in a session of meditation, that's one of the 4 parts. And in Lam Rim commentaries and other things, what they say is that the first thing that we should do, given that we've established a place where we're, of course it's true that we can meditate anywhere, and it's so certainly, I wouldn't say that a person, if you're traveling, or if you're in the mood to meditate on a bench, in the courtyard at work during lunch, of course take other opportunities, in your car, before you get out of your car on your way to work, if you want to take a few minutes. There's many wonderful places to stop and to do a little meditation break. But here, when we're talking about like a formal session of meditation, generally speaking, that's the kind of thing we most often would do in our own home, kind of at a particular time, that we're going to set aside for meditation. So prior to starting that, I would say it's really good, because in these commentaries and things, they point out that you want to clean the space, that's kind of the first step. You want to take a look at where you're going to meditate and make sure that it's kind of orderly, and that it's, that there's nothing distracting. There's not socks on the floor. There's not, there's no visible, dust or cobwebs. And it's also, if you have like a duster, a feather duster, and, even though you don't see anything, it can be a practice to clean the altar with a feather duster, and just to get into the habit of that and to keep things straight. Because if things are distracting, if there is some, toys on the floor or what have you, that will affect the mind. That will have an impact. Uh, so that also plays into, where am I going to put, my space? You want to try to put it in a place that's in some way kind of self-contained. If it's difficult for most people to have a room with a door, just for meditation, but to try to find a place where, when you're seated in meditation facing your altar, it's naturally kind of just the altar, maybe, that there's not a lot of busyness in your visual field. So it's just sort of up against a plain wall, let's say. So that's really the first step, is to kind of take a look at where you intend to meditate and just make sure that it's kind of neat. Yeah. And then once we have done that, of course, I guess, I mean, the next thing, if you want, would be to set out offerings, which is another thing they don't talk about in Meditation 101. So again, I'm kind of going off script, but Venerable Katie may have talked about water bowls, or she may plan to. It's quite common to have water bowls on the altar, making water bowl offerings in the morning, taking them down at night, putting food on the altar, flowers, incense, light, making offerings on your altar is kind of the second thing that you would generally do after you've cleaned the space, but entirely up to you. Just talking about practices that are common and historical, and that can be quite meaningful. Okay, so, but now going back on script, what they talk about in Meditation 101 is that the first thing that you want to do is pay attention to your body and mind. Whether there's a lot of nervous energy in the body, whether there's a lot of sleepiness, kind of just getting in touch with what is happening in the body. Is my mind racing? Am I dealing with tiredness? Checking in with your body and mind, and because then that has a role to play in what kind of antidotes you might decide to employ. Maybe if your mind is really agitated and racing, you might decide, well, before I actually start, maybe I'll do a little bit of light exercise. Maybe I'll read a little bit. Maybe I'll go, just around the block, go for a little walk, just kind of do some activity that might make the meditation a little bit more fruitful. Because you're not necessarily trying to deal with that energy during the session. You've kind of dealt with it before the session, and then your session is maybe a little bit more productive. And then similarly, if you're exhausted, you might decide, well, maybe this isn't the best time to meditate, or you might do a little bit of you might kind of raise your energy a bit. Maybe you have a little bit of tea, to kind of raise that energy. Or if you are noticing patterns, then you might decide to make adjustments to the time of day that you are choosing to meditate, or the activities that are occurring before your kind of like, maybe not a good idea to do a lot of intense exercise, come back from the gym and then put your meditation session. Then maybe you're noticing that doesn't work. So the first thing that you want to do is just check in with your body and mind and try to keep track of what's happening. Yeah. And then, at this point now, we've decided to meditate. We're about to meditate. We are seated in meditation posture on a cushion, ideally, perhaps, or on a chair, just depending on, what's reasonable for you. Either is fine. And now you set your motivation before you engage in the actual session. So FPMT has a text called Daily Prayers that has a sort of a sample list of traditional practices, what are called the preliminary prayers, refuge and bodhicitta, the seven limbs. Those are the historical things. But it's your meditation session, so set your motivation, using whatever works for you, whatever you want to do. Those are just kind of the historical ways of doing it, doing refuge and bodhicitta, the seven limbs, maybe a mandala offering, those sorts of traditional ways. But any kind of virtuous, altruistic motivation, because, I think the Venerable Katie mentioned last time, we create our reality with our minds. And so what we get out of the session of meditation depends almost entirely on the motivation that we have going into it. Even if we've just decided, oh, I'm just going to do a breathing meditation like we did at the beginning, that can seem very neutral. But if we think that the purpose of it is to develop concentration, to progress in the stages of concentration so that I can achieve enlightenment, then we've transformed something that would be neutral into something that has incredibly powerful, virtuous, energy behind it. Because just watching the breath, it's not a naturally virtuous activity. But if we think that the goal is that I need to develop high levels of concentration so that I achieve enlightenment, and that's why I'm doing it, then it's totally different, totally transformed by our motivation. Yeah. Any thoughts or questions so far on what we've talked about?
I have a question, please. So by the time we sit down and set up, how long should the meditation be?
So that's a good question on a variety of fronts, in the sense that, for one, it's a good idea to decide how long your session is going to be before you start it, because then you get in the habit of putting in the discipline of actually remaining for that time, because in the beginning it's new. It's kind of, it can seem kind of dull or repetitive over time, and the mind can that's why distraction arises. The mind is kind of rebelling against the discipline of trying to hold the mind to a chosen object. So we might just say, oh, well, that's enough. It's been, we just get frustrated with it, and then, and we kind of beat ourselves up maybe because we feel like there's so many distractions, it's not going well. And we just decide arbitrarily to stop that session. And that's not a great habit to get into, just kind of random lengths of time that are determined by how bored we are, how frustrated we are, how strongly the distractions are arising. So it's very good to say, I will do a session of X number of minutes. So then how many minutes is reasonable is your question for how do I pick? And that doesn't have, a fixed answer, except to say that it's clear in the teachings that we should keep, if we're new to meditation, we ought to keep the sessions short. It's much better to do multiple short sessions in a day than it is to try to do, half an hour or 45, 40, something like that. So I would, there's no really amount of time that's like given. Somewhere between, 5 and 10 minutes to start, I think is good. Because one of the definitions of meditation is of the goal of meditation is the perfection of the ability to concentrate the mind on a chosen object. So, but as we all know, when whatever that object is, distractions will arise. And it's difficult to really maintain focused attention for long periods of time. The mind kind of gets fatigued. That just the process of noticing distraction, moving the mind back to the object, noticing distraction again, moving the mind, we start to kind of tolerate those distractions when the mind kind of gets fatigued. And then we will find that we're just kind of daydreaming more so than focusing on the chosen object. It's much more productive to say it's just going to be 5 minutes or it's just going to be 7 minutes. And to do some sort of timer, something like that. And then when the timer goes off, then your session is over. And then you take a little bit of a break. And if you want to do another session, great, do another session. But don't try to do, it's better to do 2 10-minute sessions with a break than it is to do one 20-minute session. But then, of course, over time, we do want to increase the length of time. We don't want to be meditating for 10 years and still be doing 10-minute sessions, only 10-minute sessions. Gradually over time, we want to lengthen that process, but it needs to be organic. It needs to be independent upon how much of that session I was really engaged in high quality focused attention. Um, and I don't really have like a percentage, because of course for us in the beginning, it's like 5% of the meditation. It was good, high quality, and 95% was the mind was kind of all over the place. And then but that steadily increases over time. Somewhere maybe around, 70, 80%, once we get there, when we can really genuinely say that I was truly on the object without significant distraction for, 7 out of 10 minutes, then we can add a couple of minutes. And then when we get to 70% of that, we can add a few more minutes. Certainly, I would encourage you to ask like a geshe or, someone with, more experience to give you a better, but that's kind of the general idea, is that you want it to be led by how concentrated you genuinely were. And not like, oh, it's been a month or oh, it's been 3 months. And so just arbitrarily, I'm going to add time. It's much better to add sessions than it is to add time to the sessions. Okay. So that's the motivation. So we checked in with the body and mind after cleaning the space and making offerings. If we wanted to, we checked in with the body and mind and kind of applied antidotes to what was going on in the body and mind. We've sat down, we've motivated, and now we've started the actual meditation session. And here, not only in addition to how long, we also want to decide what the object is prior to the start of the session. 10 minutes before, whatever, an hour before, we should say, oh, I'm about to do a session of meditation on loving kindness or on the breath or whatever it is, so that going into it what it is. And then of course we don't change that object during that session of meditation. We stick with it, regardless of what comes up in the mind, regardless of what kind of distractions arise. If we're meditating on death, let's say, and we think about a loved one that died, strong feelings of love might arise. But for the purposes of that meditation, that's a distraction. It's quite good to meditate on love, but if you've decided to meditate on death, then meditating on love is a distraction, and you need to go back to like, okay, well, maybe my next session, I'll meditate on love, but for now, that's not what I'm doing. So it's good to think about how long we're going to meditate for and what the object is. And then to really have discipline about staying on the cushion for that length of time. Because again, we've decided that it's going to be a reasonable length of time. We're not pushing too far, but we're also not giving up after 2 or 3 minutes because the mind is, agitated or, what have you. Yeah, and then to decide what the actual session is. So then whatever the object was, you did your best for however long you chose, and then that session is over when the timer goes off. And now the last part of the process is dedication, which you may have done in other classes or you may be doing already in this class at the end. And again, in that text, Daily Prayers, FPMT also has sample kinds of dedication prayers that you could use if you wanted to. But you can, it's your session of meditation, your spiritual practice. You dedicate in whatever way you want. But the idea is that the psychological purpose of dedication really, I think, is so that it serves kind of the same role as motivation, in the sense that it protects the session, that what we did, it protects the virtue of it, it protects the positive, benefit of it, by not letting our ego kind of co-opt what we've done. There's a real tendency to think, oh, like, no one is meditating on love, but I am. How cool that I'm this great. I took time out of my day to meditate on love. That's great. I did this really great thing. Now, of course, we should rejoice in our own positive actions, but we don't want to do it in like a really egoistic way where it inflates our sense of self-importance. We want to do it in a way where we recognize this. I do want to move in this direction. I do want to do more of this. So I want to value it and I want to think of it as positive, but not in a way where it increases our delusions, where it increases our sense of, again, self-importance, or thinking and putting other people down because we're such a great practitioner, because we did this thing. So if at the end of the session, we really cultivate this view of totally giving away everything that we just did for the benefit of others, that counteracts that tendency that we all have. It's totally normal. It's the egoistic mind that we're all struggling with. It's not abnormal, but we want to do something about that so that what we just did actually remains virtuous and positive. So we want to cultivate this sense of that what I just did was for the benefit of others. I dedicate all of that positivity, may it ripen for other, all sentient beings, rather than, just thinking I did something really great. How cool am I for doing that? Um, so you can write your own, of course, you can do different. You can do, if you don't have a lot of time, you can do a really short dedication. If you have more time, you can do a more expansive. It can be really beautiful, the dedication prayers, that you can find within FPMT. They can be several minutes long, and it can be a really powerful, really beautiful, poetic practice that has a lot of energy and power to it. But you just want to do some kind of dedication at the end of every single session so if you meditate 3 times a day, you want to dedicate at the end of every single session. And then, again, depending on how much time you have, you can do longer or shorter. Same with motivation, can be longer or can be shorter. Okay, so those are the four parts of a well, I did 6, I think. So those are the 6 parts of a meditation session. Any thoughts or questions? Mm-hmm.
Thank you very much. I am very, very new because I never practiced meditation besides attending at 8 o'clock with Sarah and the group. So when you're talking about the object, when, for example, you meditate about love and kindness, and then you think about the object, can you give me the example, please? Yeah.
So the object of so there's different kinds of, has Venerable Katie gone over analytical meditation and stabilizing meditation, or I don't know if
I didn't attend.
oh, okay.
I did attend last week and I got completely lost.
Sure. So in Tibetan Buddhism, which is the lineage that our center is based on, generally speaking, we divide objects of meditation into objects that are analytical in nature or objects that are stabilizing or single pointed in nature. And they serve different purposes. So a stabilizing or single pointed meditation object, the theory behind it, the reason that it's called that is because in theory, if we're going to meditate for 5 minutes, the object can be present in the mind for all of those 5 minutes without the use of any kind of conceptuality, any kind of words or logic or thoughts or ideas, concepts of any kind. So, for example, the breath is a stabilizing or single pointed object because you're breathing. If you're alive, you're breathing, so the object is present, and it's a physical sensation that you're not generating with the use of thoughts, with concepts. You're literally just noticing the physical sensation that is arising when you are breathing. It changes, it becomes more subtle over the course of 5 or 10 minutes. So the sensation itself is a bit dynamic, but your instruction is simply to notice whatever is arising in that, for that breath, as the breathing, each breath, whatever is arising in that moment, you're just noticing what's arising in that moment. The moment, the perception changes, like I said, but whatever's arising in that moment is the object. If you were to meditate on compassion, then that's an analytical meditation. And it depends. I mean, it depends on how much detail, because there's different purposes of analytical meditations. Some analytical meditations, their goal, like meditating on impermanence, for example, is the goal of that is to become more familiar with an aspect of reality, to understand something. So that's the goal is wisdom. The goal is I'm not really familiar with an aspect of reality that's true, and my goal is to become more familiar with an aspect of reality that is true. According to the Buddha, at least. We can debate with the Buddha, we can, see if we think it's true, but from the Buddha's perspective, it is true, and our goal is to understand it more deeply. A meditation on compassion, though, is different. In one way, it's also true that we're not deeply familiar. Of course, the goal is still to become familiar with the object, but the goal is not to learn it, but it isn't true that compassion is an aspect of reality. Compassion is a mental state that we can generate, but we can also generate its opposite. We can also generate, ill will toward sentient beings. Those are both options for the mind. And, in one way, we could say that compassion is a more valid, state of mind, for various reasons. It's not empowered by the delusions. It's not, but the goal of a analytical meditation on compassion is to actually suffuse the mind with compassion. Whereas, to actually become the nature, to transform the mind into the nature of compassion. Whereas we don't transform the mind into the nature of impermanence, because the mind is already impermanent. We're just trying to understand that things are impermanent. So analytical meditations, they serve different functions, but they are characterized either way with the fact that we do have to use concepts and words and logic to generate the object. When you generate the object of impermanence, you have to literally bring to mind examples of impermanence. The body aging, people dying, the seasons changing, things that we love breaking. You literally, and so you're using conceptuality to demonstrate impermanence to yourself so that it becomes familiar. But when you generate compassion, what you're doing is you are causing that state of mind to arise, and then you're generalizing that state of mind. So generally what you would do, we all have compassion to one degree or another. No one is completely devoid of any compassion. Some people have practiced it more than others. Some people find it easier to move into than others. We all need to expand our capacity for compassion, but we all can generate it, for an injured animal, for a family member, for a spouse, for a child, for our child, for someone experiencing a war or famine. We can bring to mind examples, whatever they might be, where that subjective state of mind will spontaneously arise. And then our goal is to think about increasingly difficult situations where it doesn't arise for us as naturally, as spontaneously. And what we then do is we try to remember, when I did have compassion, what did it feel like? What was in my body and mind when I actually had compassion? And then I just try to remember that and just kind of pretend, in a way, kind of pretend that I have compassion in meditation for a different situation, because we literally just try to move back into a memory of it and just hold that memory while we imagine some other circumstance. And if we do that a lot, the theory is we will find it easier to expand that mental state. And it's complemented too by thinking about the advantages of compassion, the disadvantages of ill will. So, I mean, there's other parts to it. But that's kind of the general idea, is that by causing love or compassion or the spirit of generosity, or in terms of like patience, thinking about the advantages of patience, the disadvantages of anger, kind of thinking of a situation where we were impatient. How did that go? What negative consequences flowed from our actual memory of being impatient? And then how might it have gone had we been patient, had we practiced patience? There's a variety of different ways that we can approach that, but the goal is to, in terms of most of those objects, the goal is to suffuse the body and mind with that mental state. With some objects like emptiness, with impermanence, the goal is to understand, to recognize that it is an aspect of reality that we need to have insight into. Did that answer your question? I rambled for so long, I'm not sure.
No. Yeah, Venerable, yes. Oh, thank you. Yeah.
Okay. Okay. So now we'll talk about visualization meditation. So, visualization meditation is pretty common in Tibetan Buddhism, and it's often employed to mainly to visualize enlightened beings. That's generally how it's used. And so when we do that, the different enlightened beings that we visualize, it's in a way, I kind of think of it as a supplementary system of meditation to the more, because it's partially, um, it has aspects of analytical meditation, and it has aspects of stable. I mean, all I should point out that all meditation that is analytical also has a stabilizing aspect to it, because I don't want to give anyone the impression that analytical meditation and stabilizing meditation are two completely separate things. There are meditations that are only stabilizing, like, like the breath. But when we do an analytical meditation, the goal is, once we've used concepts, once we've used logic or reasoning to generate the object, then the goal is to single pointedly focus our attention on that object, to hold it in the mind without distraction to the best of our ability. So it becomes stabilizing when we get to that point. Yeah. So a visualization meditation, it has, let's say we're meditating on Shakyamuni Buddha. Why do people keep joining and leaving? What's happening? I'm getting self-conscious. So, okay. So I guess it's because I'm not Venerable Katie, and if I'm not Venerable Katie, there's no reason to be here. Like, what's the point?
Well, what they don't know is we've been held hostage and we've been trying to leave.
So, okay, so let's say that we're meditating on Shakyamuni Buddha. So the analytical aspect of this is that prior to the session, we need to develop a familiarity with what that object is, because it's not anything. It's a very specific thing. There's written descriptions of Shakyamuni Buddha that you find in the sadhana, or in what you're doing, where it says, this many arms, this many for the different things. They're holding different implements, there's different colors, there's different numbers of faces, all kinds of different aspects to these different visualizations, and that's all written out for you in whatever it is that you might be doing. So, and also you might reference visual material. You might reference a statue, you might reference a tanka, to get a sense of what it is that you'll be doing. Because when we say visualization meditation, we mean using the imagination. We don't mean that you look at an image single pointedly without distraction for 10 minutes. You might do that, but that's not meditation. You might do that before your session. You might have a tanka. You might spend some time looking at it, but that's not meditation, because you're using your eyes. Visualization meditation is an imaginative exercise, but we do need to have familiarity with whatever the enlightened being is, so that when we're imagining, we're doing it, more or less correctly. Now, of course, that's a process that can evolve over time, and it does evolve over time. No one is going to read a description of Shakyamuni Buddha and then have all of those aspects clearly, vividly present in the mind when they are trying to meditate. There's going to be haziness. There's going to be whole parts of it that are just not there. There's going to be, all kinds of things. And that's 100% fine. The goal is that through repetition, over time, the visualization gets more clear. It gets more vivid, more distinct. The different parts are more accurate, and so on. So part of it is what are the colors, how many arms, what are the implements, all of that. But then also, what do they mean? Like, why is it that color? Why is it that implement? What is, because Vajrasattva is different than Shakyamuni Buddha, which is different than Avalokiteshvara, which is different than Manjushri. And so what's the purpose? What does that Buddha embody? What is their, what aspect of enlightened mind are they representing? What am I trying to get more familiar with? So that was what I meant when I said that it's kind of a complementary system to a purely analytical, like a logical analytical meditation, where, because you can increase your familiarity with compassion by doing what I described earlier. You can also do it by visualizing Avalokiteshvara, the Buddha of compassion, because he is the embodiment of that energy. And so in a way, these visualizations, they're kind of like memory palaces, if you're familiar with that term, where, to remember a whole bunch of different things. Like if you want to memorize, table, chair, painting, you visualize a room with a particular painting with a table and a chair, and then you've memorized like those words. The visualizations of the Buddhas are kind of like that, because the colors, the implements, the hand gestures, those all have deep meaning that are related to the aspect of enlightened mind that they represent. And and there's mantra too that gets involved, and the resonance of that, and works energetically on the subtle energy system. So there's different aspects there, but we also have to get familiar with the meaning behind the colors, the meaning behind the implements, so that when we visualize those, that meaning, it's not there in concepts, it's not there in words, but it's there in our understanding. Just like you look at a stop sign and you know that a stop sign means stop. You don't have to think about it, just you have like a feeling of stop when you see it. So when you visualize Vajrasattva, you want to get to the point where you have that feeling of like cleansing, that feeling of, purification. And that should be different than the feeling that arises when you're visualizing Avalokiteshvara. That's the energy of compassion, which is a totally different aspect of enlightened mind. So, they both do the same thing, but they do it in different ways, complementary or supplementary ways, I would say. And then, of course, I would say some people will say that, well, I'm not good at visualizing. I find it, and so they might use that as, an excuse for like not, it's like, oh, I'm just not, I don't have a good imagination, and so on. But if we think about our favorite food, or we think about our pet, or we think about our parents, we can bring that image to mind vividly, clearly, with the smells and the sounds and the, so it isn't true that we're bad at visualizing. We're just not familiar with the images of enlightened beings yet. We're deeply familiar with pizza. We're deeply familiar with, our best friend. So those are things that we can, if we wanted to meditate on our best friend above the crown of our head, we'd have no trouble. We're just not familiar with what Avalokiteshvara looks like, what he symbolizes. But through repetition, through discipline, we can easily demonstrate to ourselves that that image can be just as vivid and as clear as thinking about an ice cream cone above the crown of our head. That we can definitely accomplish that without, too much time, within a few years, of trying. And then I'm sort of alluded to other ways in which we might use visualization, because I mentioned using memories of either when things went well or when things didn't go well, and then visualizing, that we didn't lose our temper, visualizing that instead we remembered to say kind words, we remembered to, that's kind of, in a way, that's a very common psychological technique that they use. I mean, it's used secularly in sports. It's used in, all kind, where you're kind of visualizing doing things the right way. You're visualizing the ball going into the hoop. It's really the same. It's the same psychological process. But you're doing it in a virtue, you're doing it in relation to virtue. So, you're remembering a time when you lost your temper, and then you're imagining that you didn't lose your temper, that you practiced patience. And then the theory is, if you do that, and you can do that like at the end of the day, think, oh, well, when this person cut me off, I really had a negative reaction. So at the end of the day, I'm going to play that back, and I'm going to imagine that it went differently. That's another really common way that we use visualization. It's very powerful too, for helping us to stay on track, to do the right kinds of things. Any thoughts or questions? No. I think Venerable Katie's better at doing that. Yes.
No,
Yeah.
no, no, no. No, that's not true. I know that you're coming today. That's why I was so happy. I would like to ask you a question regarding about visualize how to say that, visualization. So let's say I have some health issue and I would like to pray medicine Buddha. So I should study what her color like, what is the mantra, what is is that right, Venerable?
Yeah, I mean, FPMT in their foundation store, they have several different kinds of, many different, what are called sadhanas, or practice texts
Yeah.
on the different deities. Deity just is a English translation of Yidam, just means enlightened, meditational deity, just means an enlightened being, like for whom we have a meditation practice. Because in English, deity is not I don't like it's kind of fraught, but it just means that an enlightened being for whom we have a meditation practice. So there's varying lengths of sadhanas, but they will all have a written description, which can be helpful. And then you can just go online and you can Google like medicine Buddha tankas. FPMT also, they have like cards. They have little cards that you can get with the images. I think kind of both are doing both is helpful. Reading the descriptions and then also looking at images, because you can get the proportions of things when you look at it's a sort of a science. I'm sure at some point we'll do classes at the center on like drawing, and it's really very scientific. They measure out, they where the nose is and like where the eyes are. So the proportions are actually, because that keeps all of the tankas, the same for generations. In the monasteries, they have texts on like how to draw the face of this, how to draw the face of that, so that there's not like a billion different kinds of interpretations of these different things. What shade of purple, what, because the blue, I mean, it's blue, but it's, it can be kind of a dark blue sometimes. Yeah.
I do have her image on my altar, yeah, and I pray for the mantra, but then I think I need to study more the color, what is she holding in her hand, I kind of know that, but I don't, not in my mind, yeah, but I should do that.
Yeah, again, it's just the power of familiarity, the power of repetition. Just doing, just pick a really short sadhana, like a 5 page, and just try to do it, every day, for 15 minutes. If that's what if that's, for that, time or that month or, you know, and then it'll just come easier and easier over time. Um,
Yeah. Well, thank you.
okay, so now we'll do, because the Venerable Katie wanted to, she's good at doing lots of short sessions, and I didn't really do a lot of meditating tonight, but we'll do, so you can tell her that I did what she wanted. We actually did a visualization meditation. We'll just do a real simple visualization, purification with light meditation. So kind of get back into a stable, comfortable, upright position. With our feet flat and our back straight. Again, just have the sense of letting go of the environment, letting go of the past and the future, going inward. And concentrating on the breath for a couple of minutes to settle the mind. And then try to develop an awareness of yourself in meditation. Visualizing a sphere of golden white light above the crown of your head, maybe about the size of your fist. And think that this light represents all of the perfected, positive qualities that you yourself wish to embody. And try to stabilize that visualization as clearly as you can. And imagine that this orb of light becomes smaller and smaller in diameter until it's about the size of a marble. And visualize that it travels through the top of the head, down through the body, alighting at the heart center, where it begins to expand. Rays of golden white light are emanating from the sphere in all directions. As it becomes larger and larger, completely filling the body and mind with these perfected, virtuous qualities. Think that it displaces any tendencies, habits that you wish to reduce. Any non-beneficial ways of thinking or acting. Thinking of those as the nature, as being in the nature of pollution. And think that that pollution is forced out of the body and mind through the soles of your feet. As that golden white light completely suffuses every part of the body and mind. And concentrate on that visualization. And then when you're ready, we'll come back together. All right. So, any thoughts or questions on anything that we've talked about today? Well, I think I've reached the end of the material that I was assigned. Mhm.
uh, venerable, venerable. So, in the morning, I mean, in the beginning, when we start a meditation, we take the refuge. Yeah, did I say that correctly? And then we can offer mandala, something like that. And when we're done, at the end, we do the dedication. So, Venerable, so what is the dedication?
So, yeah, like I mentioned, there's short ones, there's really long, extensive ones. Often it's common that they will include long life prayers, like prayers for the long lives of one's teachers, the lineage lamas. Um, usually, um, you know, um, you'll be there's a praise to bodhicitta, may bodhicitta, may that the bodhicitta that has not arisen, may it arise and grow, may that which has arisen not diminish but increase more and more. That's a common line, but the goal you know the goal is to make it meaningful, for oneself. So the goal is to think that what I've done has created positive energy, karmically speaking. So because we motivated well, and then we engaged in an activity, and so we have necessarily created some positive karmic potential in the mind, and that positive. So in one way, what I mentioned before was kind of the psychological process of using dedication to as an antidote to the ego kind of getting involved, and that's certainly a really important level. We can also talk about a more esoteric, or the karmic level of dedication, where the idea literally is that I know this isn't really your question, but because you asked, like, what do I actually do for dedication? But another way of thinking about the purpose of dedication is that we have actually generated a positive karmic seed in the mind, and that karmic seed in the future will ripen, because that's what karma does. Karma ripens, when the causes and conditions are such that karmic seed will ripen. And so dedicating, thinking about that karmic seed, and thinking, when this karmic seed ripens, may it do so in these really, really expanded, altruistic, beneficial, the end of war, the end of poverty, the end of disease, the full enlightenment of every sentient being. These incredibly, beautiful, poetic, grandiose visions. We're kind of sealing it in that direction, rather than, because on its own, yes, we've created a positive karmic seed, and yes, that positive karmic seed will ripen, and yes, it will ripen in a beneficial way, right? Because that's the nature of a positive karmic seed, cannot ripen as suffering. It can only ripen as something useful, something beneficial. But that could be like being wealthy. That could be having high status. You know, it might not necessarily be something that useful. I mean, yes, it's not a suffering experience. It's better to be, to have resources. It's better. But in and of itself, it's not that useful. So we're kind of actually directing that positive, we're turning something into, we're turning something that could be kind of an ordinary useful thing into a useful thing that's spiritual in nature, that is actually directed toward my own enlightenment, the enlightenment of all other sentient beings. We're turning it into, because we're now, of course, there's factors in terms of like the stability of our concentration. I mean, there's factors that are involved, but the more we do it, the better, the more concentration we have, the more of a habit it is. And we also just become someone who starts to think that way, which I think is inherently beneficial. We start to think, may all sentient beings be free of suffering. May they have happiness. May they, we start to familiarize our mind with just the ideas that are expressed in these prayers. And we start to become someone who wants that for the world, which I think is inherently useful. But what are the words, kind of was, I think, kind of your more specific question. And they're really, as I mentioned, FPMT, they have daily prayers, and then they have the retreat book. There's daily prayers, and then there's essential. There's the prayer books, essential prayers, volumes 1 and 2, and then there's retreat prayers. So within those resources, you find different examples of dedication prayers. But you can also, like I said, you can also just write your own, whatever speaks to you, whatever, and of course it can change. Like if there's a mass shooting, or if there's a natural disaster, or, there's some threat that people are facing that's happening that day, then of course that you integrate that into your dedicate. You think of the people that just died, or that are under threat of that particular whatever it might be, and bring them into that one day's dedication prayer. But yeah, so as essential prayers, volumes 1 and 2, daily prayers, and the retreat handbook, those are all available on fpmt.org in the Foundation store. You can find different examples.
You know what, I I kind of understand now, because we do that in Vietnamese language as well. So yeah, so I understand now. Yeah. Oh, thank you, Venerable.
Of course. All right, so we are out of time. So guess what? Now we're going to dedicate. We just talked about it, and now we're going to do it. So we think back. We did create an altruistic motivation at the beginning of our class, something related to trying to use what we learn to put an end to our own suffering, to put an end to the suffering of others. Not just wanting to increase our knowledge so that we could, impress others, but actually looking for tools, looking for techniques to put into practice to get the results. That was the motivation. That created positive energy in the mind. Now we think that we want that positive energy to ripen in the best way. So, in whatever way is meaningful for you, think about that energy being the cause of all of that incredible positivity that you can visualize, that you want to come to pass in your own life, the lives of all other sentient beings. And just seal that energy in that direction. All right. Well, thank you very much for attending, and you guys will finish next week. Or, yes, that's true, next week. All right.
Oh, thank you so much.
Thank you.